Welcome, everyone. This is now week 3. And being that it is week 3 of Conchas y Café, that means that next week, just to start off with the announcement, next week we'll actually be workshopping people's work. So, there's a few pieces that I've seen turned in already in the very first week's session on Google Classroom. And so I'll get through those sometime this week. And then, pieces that have been uploaded to the assignment from last week, I'll try to get through those as well before next Tuesday. But next Tuesday, we will be workshopping everybody that hopes to get some feedback from the rest of the group. And of course, I'll remind everybody about that before the end of the session too, but might as well take advantage now while we're getting started. So yeah, week 3 and Conchas y Café is getting deep. Last week we covered monism and pluralism. The week before we talked about the manifesto and the purpose of the manifesto. And this week we're going to actually get into a little bit more philosophy. So let's just dive right in with our quote. Now, today's quote comes from, Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes is a French literary theorist, essayist, philosopher, critic, and semiotician. So he was born on the 12th of November in 1915, and he passed away on the 26th of March in 1980. Y como teorista de literatura y filósofo, él hablaba mucho sobre pues el lenguaje. And that's basically what it means to be a semiotician. It means that you study the sign and what the sign actually means. And I'll explain that a little bit more after we're done covering our quotes today. But Roland Barthes, he wrote, "I am interested in language because it wounds or seduces me." Y aquí traducido les puse, "Me interesa el lenguaje porque me hiere o me seduce." So what do you guys think? What Roland Barthes say to you? And I just posted it in the chat. I'll post the Spanish one in the chat as well. Pero ¿qué piensan? What does this mean for you?
Communicating is fun.
The
How
power
so?
of the word.
The power of the word. Communicating is fun. Words have power, for sure. Abraham, did you raise your hand?
Oh yeah. Well, that language is a double-edged sword because it can really harm people or make them feel better. It's soothing. So it has a lot of power, but who uses it makes it whatever direction it wants to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I can definitely see how you're expanding on that idea a little bit more. Words can be used as a weapon. Let's see, yeah, that's a possibility for sure. He specifically says, "I am interested in language because it wounds or seduces me." Felicia writes,
I think I like that's what makes it so fun because, well, what if, everything about a wound, either if it's a war wound or an emotional wound, whatever, I'm not saying it's always fun, but sometimes it's fun looking back at it. And then seduce me, well, yeah, because how many times can you make someone feel better? Or, I don't know, I'll say it because I'm a mom, right? So I have kids. So I know the power of my voice for this little lullaby that I made up for them. It's the same thing I sing to both of them. They're 5 years apart, but it not seduce, but it would make them go to bed and it would relax them. And I could just see all their worry go away from their face, whatever it was, with just those little words that I would say. And so it's that it can really take you to a really good place or to a really bad place. What everybody's been saying, pretty much.
Yeah, but I like that you provided an example of that happening, right? Yeah, Felicia wrote, words can be enticing and painful. You know, I think that's maybe something that Roland Barthes is saying in there. Again, it is what the quote is I am interested in language because it wounds or seduces me. Kathy, saw you raise your hand.
What's coming up is Don Miguel Ruiz. Do you know Don Miguel Ruiz, the 4 agreements? And one of the 4 agreements he has is be impeccable with your word. And what this quote reminds me of is being interested in language because it makes us aware of what we're saying when we do use it in whichever way, because we use it in both ways, wounding or seduction. That's us being human. That's what we do. If we want something, we use words a certain way. If we want something to go away, we use words a certain way. So that's kind of like being aware and mindful and having that interest in what do the words do.
Yeah. Miss Lois, I see you speaking, but you're on mute. If you're able to unmute yourself, we would be able to hear you. So it looks like you're on a mobile device. If you tap on your screen, you'll be able to see like a little icon that comes up that it looks kind of like a little microphone. If you hit the microphone button, it should unmute you. Somewhere towards the bottom of your screen there. In the meantime, to give you all a little bit of an idea of what I'm thinking with this quote, you know, it speaks about language specifically, right? And, you know, language itself can be, you know, more than just words, right? It can be symbols. It can be, you know, a lot of different things, body language, all of that. And so there's definitely, I think, something to be said about, you know, the use of language and the way in which language can sort of attract us or push us away. Yeah, thank you, Abraham, for putting in the chat there a little bit more about Miguel Angel Ruiz. Yeah, so we do have a second quote. Unless if anybody has something else to add, we might as well move on to the second quote. So we're going to go back here. Now, the next quote comes from Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was born on the 20th of July in 1925 and passed away the 6th of December in 1961. He was a French West Indian psychiatrist, political philosopher, Pan-Africanist, and Marxist humanist from the French colony of Martinique. Y aquí en español les traducí lo que él dijo. El hablar un lenguaje es adoptar a un mundo, una cultura. And in English, what Frantz Fanon wrote, he wrote, to speak a language is to take on a world, a culture. What do you guys think about that? Ani?
I totally agree with that. As I've gotten to know other cultures, I see that, you know, we create words to express the values that are important to us, to our culture and our community. We create words to talk about things that that reflect the way we see the world. And so when you look at a language, it's kind of a window or a key into the culture that created it. So we create words to express ourselves, but we're expressing those things that are important to us, you know, and important to our culture. And every time I pass by a donut shop that says, you know, Happy Lucky Donuts or whatever, and I know that it's a Chinese-owned establishment. When I started reading novels about Chinese culture, I really understood finally why they were doing that, because those words in the Chinese culture represent values that are very important to their culture. It doesn't translate so great into English, but it reflects something about themselves. And so if you were inside of their language, you would also be experiencing that culture.
Yeah. Abraham?
This really resonated on me because I'm writing a book that has to do with the forgotten languages, especially of Native Americans, and how much a language reflects the people who speak it. Because the way we think, we express in the language, and so language tells a lot about the people speaking it. So I really like this one.
Yeah, it definitely does. Jess?
Hey, so yeah, I was gonna say,
Hold on a second. All right, go ahead.
When I think about the both of them, what I like about Roland Barthes or whatever, just based off of what we've been learning the last 3 weeks, is I like the fact that he used like the word interested in language, because it means or seduces me. Because to me, it shows that he's willing to learn. He has an interest in something outside of what he knows. Right? I think that's what a lot of stuff that we're missing, and like kind of speaking to like what Plato and all the people we've been talking about, how whoever has the voice, that's the story that's heard, and you know how important it is to know your story and where you're coming from. And it's funny because when I was reading this, I remember the last week's poem too. We said that when she said, "I hear my language," or "I hear the language of my," and I had mentioned that. I'm like, it's so true. Like I can be American, right? Well, I am an American. I'm proud American. But even when I go to certain neighborhoods, or if I were to go to Mexico and I hear Spanish, there is like this little tingle that comes around me. Or I can see like if there's someone in my community that's struggling, and I'm like, oh, hola, or whatever the hell I say, something to like let them know, like, hey, you need something, I'm right here, you know? There's this like this emotion. I guess because I'm probably looking at seduce like sexual, but it doesn't have to be. But that's a me thing. Maybe, I don't know. It's my age. I don't know. But yeah, but seduce is like something good, right? So I think the fact that this person, Roland, and whenever he was born, was interested in something other than himself was like respectable. Because he can take the language, like it says here, and the culture and where that word comes from, and understand that person's narrative. So there's just the pure interest in knowing another language, for I don't care what language, to me is like a good indicator of a good person.
I like that. I can appreciate that, especially, if you're a person that doesn't know a language and is actively seeking to understand it. Karen in the chat wrote, right, that you understand a language so much more when you understand their language. I'm sorry, you understand a culture so much more when you understand their language. And I think that, what Ani said about understanding the reasons for naming a donut shop Happy Lucky, culturally speaking, they make more sense if you understand where it's coming from. So yeah. Kathy? Sorry, you're on mute, Kathy.
There we go.
Yeah.
For me, it brings up the when I moved here to the South, and coming from Los Angeles and coming into the South and learning a language and learning what bless your heart really meant, and what was behind that, and what it meant to relate to people and get to know everyone. It was huge. And then when I met all the Latinos, the kids growing up here, they're growing up here in the South, and they're building their own language as they're growing up here. It's amazing to watch how the words they come up with, how they relate to each other, what they do. It's incredible to see how our language is tribal.
Definitely. That is very true. Language can be very tribal, for sure. And like Abraham is saying in the chat, those subcultures develop their own sub-language. And there's definitely, I think, a reason for that. Jess, saw you raised your hand again. You're on mute, Jess.
After Kathy said that, because I'm originally from Ohio, but it's funny because my best friend in the whole world, I call her my sister. She's from Lake Charles, Louisiana, and so we're different just culturally, right? She's from the South, Caucasian. She's about 10 years old, but we're like best of friends. Anyways, we live down the street from each other. But the other day I told her, she came over, I cooked dinner for her, and I told her, I said, Lenny, I need a good Southern insult. Like, because, I mean, I was using it for the wrong reason, but I mean, it wasn't, nobody in the room, I was not going to offend anybody in the room, but it was just the way I told her, the way language, I'm like, the way you guys, sometimes when you hear Southern people say something, you don't know if it's a compliment or if it's not. So that's what I told her. I said, I need a really good Southern way to say X, Y, Z, whatever I told her to say. And she's really good at that. That's a Southern thing, a Southern American thing. I'm not a Southern American, but I love a good Southern sideways talk. You have to use it. I was around people that would only understand it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually, I think, a good segue into our next quote. Just because, I've really been thinking a lot about our the ways in which we unify people and the ways in which we sometimes influence people. And so I figured, let's build on these quotes. Normally we only do one, but we've been doing three. And so let's look at the third one. So this last quote that we'll be discussing comes from George Orwell, and this comes specifically from his novel 1984. And George Orwell, para los que no conocen a George Orwell, nació el 25 de junio en el año 1903, falleció el 21 de enero en 1950. And, I don't know why I always imagined George Orwell was American, but he's actually English. And he was a novelist, essayist, journalist, and critic. 1984 is definitely, I think, a very strong example of his work as a cultural critic. Pero él escribió, pero si el pensamiento corrupta al lenguaje, el lenguaje también puede corruptar al pensamiento. In English, but if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. So I think kind of ties in a little bit with what was just being said about, the ways in which, you can take like, say, a Southern insult, right? But yeah, what do you guys think about what George Orwell is saying in this quote in particular? I see some head nods there. But what do you think George Orwell is really meaning by what he's saying here? Language has limits. Oh, sometimes our language limits us. Yeah, Karen, I can see that. Kathy, you raised your hand.
We're living it. We're living words getting twisted, thoughts getting twisted, things that seem clear aren't so clear anymore. Mm-hmm. We're seeing it everywhere. We're seeing the messaging, what are the vaccines doing, and messages come out and they get twisted, and based on how your perception is, you're going to have a certain thought about it. Mm-hmm. That thought will create new words, and the cycle continues. Mm-hmm. It's incredible how much faster it's happening now. That 1984 was so real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jess, I see you raised your hand, and then Tina.
I promised this last time. Catherine keeps saying stuff that makes me think. Okay, so yes, and yes, you're talking about like how it's interesting that it's going so fast, but I think about that too, like with the vaccine thing, and then I don't watch. But from what I've heard, right, I just hear people bitching and complaining, like, oh, it's not happening fast enough, and I'm like, less than a year ago, we didn't even have one. Mm-hmm. Like. The amount, like, that's why I don't even let my kids get caught up in that hype, because it's so unrealistic to be that pissed and that happy from 1 month to the next. Like, how can you be so angry and sad and worried that there's no vaccine and then there is one, and now it's like, well, it's taking forever? It's like, that's a very unrealistic approach to, like, thinking, I think. And maybe it is because of, like, things are moving faster because of the internet. But it's just really, it's a really setting people up that, well, I guess I'm speaking for myself, so I can't speak for everybody, but I tried, just because that's not healthy for me to think that that's for me, and I don't want my kids to think that that's the healthiest way of thinking, that things work like that, because they're very two opposite extremes. It's like, there is nothing, and then there is, and then you hate the people that are, because it's not fast enough. It's like, there's no empathy in that, like, thought process, I think. So for all the moving parts, you know, the drivers, the scientists, the janitors that clean the labs, I mean, everybody, it's kind of like, that's a lot of pressure. And it doesn't even show any, like you're saying now. So I think that maybe that with social, I hate seeing social media, but with whatever, with the world that we're in today, how everything's so fast, that people actually believe that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think our society right now does influence.
The propaganda, or the things that people put out, right? It's like, they're, you know, it's great. It's interesting how language does work.
Yeah, you know, and I think what Kathy wrote in the chat, you know, fearful thoughts create a language. That's very, very true, you know. Conspiracy theories and things like that can definitely instill fear and have their own unique language. Tina, and then Abraham. So, Tina, you're on mute there.
I was pressing the handoff, so I'm not sure if this applies, but I'm very aware of a lot of words that people use these days. You know, like they use phrases like I feel like, and it doesn't mean that you feel it, or it's just like, I feel like it's, does it mean a thought? And I just had some other things I would say, but the basic is, if somebody asks you a question, or no, you ask somebody a question like, do you want me to fix that for you, or whatever? And sometimes the kids, or the reply is, I'll just give you, like my son, for example, it's fine. Now, does it fine mean I don't want it, or it's fine, it's I'll take it? So language is funny that way. Even today, you know, words like, what do you mean by that? That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, and I think that does speak to the way that languages can maybe begin to lose their power, right? Words in particular can begin to lose their power and their meaning over time. Abraham?
This is kind of remind me a little bit of euphemism that we talked about before, and how we use words to make them softer, or making a little bit of double meaning to them, and how some words can manifest in our minds because they play psychological games. Like when you tell somebody the word "you're a slave," and all of a sudden they start thinking the same, like "I am a slave." And words can really mess up people's head and minds.
Yeah, you know, and I think that that sort of speaks to, I think, the quotes that we had discussed before, right? You know, what Roland Barthes said about language, you know, it can either seduce or wound, right? And that's why it interests him, you know, because he wants to understand that. You know, that definitely does speak to, I think, a little bit what we're seeing and what George Orwell is saying about, you know, thoughts can influence language and language can influence thoughts. And I also think that what Frantz Fanon wrote, you know, about, you know, learning a language is to take on a culture, to take on, you know, the ways of that particular culture. You know, if you live in a culture where the language is corrupted, then you're, you know, going to feel corrupted, or you're going to continue that cycle of corruption, right? But what Kathy is saying in the chat about, you know, a language that is based on love and empathy, you know, can create a culture of perhaps love and empathy, right? So it can go all these different directions based on, you know, the way in which we think about, you know, our words and the way that we use words and the meaning behind the words. So, you know, all of that is to basically say, you know, that we are very responsible for the words that we use, right? And as writers, you're always going to really be conscious of that. You're almost always going to say, hey, is this the right word for what I'm trying to say? Or is there a better word? Am I creating a poem that is going to uplift, or am I creating a poem that is going to, make people feel agitated and do something, right? That is the purpose of the manifesto, ultimately, right? The very first week when we talked about manifesto, we were talking about being specific with your words enough so that you would get people to feel like they could come under your umbrella of your idea and become part of your movement, ultimately, right? That is sort of the main reason of a manifesto. Last week in the monism and pluralism discussion, we talked about really what is the purpose of existence, and recognizing that we ultimately have a common denominator. We're all kind of, in a way, part of the same source. We're all the same family in a sense, and the same community, although with different individual unique voices. So if we're going to create unity, we need to be aware of that. And, being aware of our language is definitely a way to also either create unity or to create, disunity, to break people apart and to isolate us. Now, at the very beginning, when we were talking about Roland Barthes was a semiotician, right? That means that he studied semiotics. And in the past, we've talked about semiotics before. Today, I'm going to cover it very briefly. So aquí tienen solo la definición de la semiótica. La semiótica es el estudio de señales y símbolos y su uso o interpretación. In the past, when I did cover semiotics, I talked about the actual founder of it, Saussure, and basically he was trying to find a way of explaining how symbols, individual symbols, they can have an impact on what we understand. But it is specifically the study of signs and symbols and their use or interpretation. So as an example of semiotics, I actually have for you a very, very famous example of semiotics in action. So this right here, quizá lo conozcan, but this is a very famous painting by René Magritte. René Magritte painted this, and he also underneath wrote, "Ceci n'est pas un pipe." Now, everyone, I'm sure you're looking at this image that's hopefully on your screen, and you're saying, that looks like a pipe, right? It's a pipe that a person uses to smoke. But the words underneath, if you don't understand French, it says, "This is not a pipe." Now, semiotics, the idea behind semiotics is that, the symbol, the sign, is going to have its defined meaning. So if we look at this in particular, this image of a pipe, and then we read, "This is not a pipe," then we have to take what the text is saying as fact. If this is telling us it's not a pipe, then the symbol, the sign, the signifier, of the words, right? Because the words become the signifier. They're defining for us what the signified is. So it can be anything else in the world, right? The signified is the pipe, the illustration, right? And it can be anything else but a pipe because the signifier, the words underneath, tell us that it is not a pipe. So we could call it an umbrella. We could call it, a parasol. We could call it a tree, whatever, but it is not a pipe. That is basically what semiotics tells us, right? Does anyone have any questions about that? That might not make a whole lot of sense at first, but if you do have questions, please feel free to let me know.
Yeah, that didn't make any sense to me.
Okay. So semiotics is, again, about the signifier and the signified, right? So the signifier is, in this case, the words, right? Words assign a meaning to the signified. So if I name my cup, then the signifier is the word cup, and the signified is the object that I'm naming. All right, so that's basically what semiotics is about. All right? Now, there has to be an agreement amongst us, all of us, culturally, to understand that this is a cup, and the word cup is what is going to be understood as a community, for the object cup. Does that help? Yeah, there has to be agreement on the symbol, as Kathy put. Yes, so like money is another example, right? The term money, that is what we all understand to mean, the object that we use to have, capitalistic transactions. That one gets a little bit more complicated, and I'll explain in a moment. But does that generally make sense about semiotics? Okay, good. Now the next one you've probably heard before. You've probably heard people say, "Oh, it's all semantics," right? But semantics is not necessarily about grammar. That's mostly what people think about. Semantics is actually the study of meaning, reference, or truth. Right? So this one can be a little bit deeper if you really think about the actual term semantics. Right? And there's different types of semantics. So when we're talking about linguistic semantics. And linguistic semantics specifically explores the relationship between form and meaning. So la semántica lingüística se relaciona más con la manera en que las cosas funcionan en relación con otras. Right? So money, as an example, semantics, in this case, in linguistic semantics, when we pull out, a dollar bill, an English dollar, an American dollar bill, excuse me, we're saying that in the United States, a dollar is worth $1. But if you go to, say, Mexico, and you pull out that same American dollar, it's going to have a different value in pesos, right? So the currency, it's all about the semantics in which we use the currency, right? In context, in the United States, an American dollar is worth only $1, but outside of the United States, it's worth whatever the conversion rate is, right? So in semantics, if I were to tell you that this is a tumbler, right, whereas a smaller one is a cup, or this is like there's like a mug. If I had a mug, a mug could also be a cup, but we call it a mug when you compare it to a single cup. All right, so that's semantics. It's the relationship between objects. And so there, when you're speaking about an object, you're changing its meaning based on its relationship with other objects that are either similar or not similar. The way that you might compare a cat to a dog, for example, you understand that a cat is a cat because it is not a dog. Does that make sense? So that would be semantics. Now, semiotics, again, that's where we all can agree that a cat is a cat because we call it a cat. And a dog is a dog because we call it a dog. Semantics gives us, again, the contrast, the understanding that they exist in their own world and, they're defined because of their relationship to one another. Tina, do you have a question? Or a comment?
I had a comment.
Mm-hmm.
So about there was Magritte, right? The painting. I always forget who painted that painting.
Yeah,
I've seen it a million times. So about Magritte and semiotics. So the whole idea, or part of the idea, is that reality is defined by us, by our signs and by our language.
Mm-hmm.
It could be something completely, absolutely different from what it is. And his play on that is saying this is not a pipe. And in one way of looking at reality, it's not a pipe, it's a painting. It's something else. entirely, you know? So, and to think about it, the word pipe is a created sign as well. And the fact that it's built the way it is a sign. And so when you start really thinking about it, your mind just kind of goes a little in circles. But yeah, basically it's the fact that signs and the way we define reality, you know, is subjective. There's a subjectivity to it.
Right. You know, everything is subjective, basically, is what it comes down to, right? Whatever we decide, whatever value we want to put on things, you know, that's the value that it will have to us. And then if we talk about a community, right? So then you start to talk about like an alphabet, right? Here in the United States, we have a particular alphabet, you know, it's A through Z. Everyone pretty much knows it if you live in the United States. But if you live in, like, say, you know, Germany, you know, in Germany, you have A through Z, but there's, like, I think a total of 29 characters as opposed to our 26 characters. Right? So, you know, there's differences. There's going to be differences in the language. There's going to be differences in the culture, and going to be differences in, you know, all sorts of different other ideas, you know, that we then start to talk about. That's David, by the way, Jess, Tina's part. Abraham, I saw you raise your hand too.
Well, for semantics, kind of, well, I don't know, there's no kids in this chat, right?
Yeah.
So it reminds me of this comedian that talks about the word as and how it's changing depends on what comes with it. That's saying that dress is an ugly ass dress. It means it's an ugly dress, right? And if you say this is badass, it means it's good, right?
Exactly. It's also, you know, I think very much more obvious when you talk about semantics, when you're talking about slang, right? If you understand the culture, you know, and you understand that there's slang within that culture, you know, when you say something is cool, you know, that's going to depend on the context in which you're saying it, right? If it's cool, you know, you're saying that it's cool to the touch, right? That the temperature-wise, it's cool. But if it's cool, you know, like, this is cool, that means that it's something that you really enjoy. Right, so, you know, those contexts are what semantics are about, right? The relationship to the meaning that you're assigning to something. So when people say, "Oh, you know, it's all in the semantics," you know, they're sort of writing off because it's something that was misunderstood. They're not necessarily using it correctly, right? It's really about reference, right? And ultimately about truth. It is the study of truth. What is true in the language that you're using? And then in the context of the painting, right, where René Magritte wrote, "This is not a pipe," you know, it's the context in which the pipe is being presented, right? It's like David said, it's an illustration of a pipe, so it is not actually the pipe, you know, it is a construct, right? Everything is constructed. Everything is whatever we want to call it, ultimately. Yeah, exactly why people get mad at the dismissal of this is all semantics. It's not semantics. It's truth, right? It's all always about the truth and whatever it is that we want to express in our truth in language. So now we do have one last term that will help us kind of understand the difference between these two. So el ideograma o ideógrafo es un símbolo gráfico que representa a una idea o concepto independiente de un lenguaje particular y palabras o frases específicas. So, ideograms or ideographs can sometimes be referred to as pictograms also, but that's going to depend on the use of the image. But an ideogram is basically a graphic symbol that represents an idea or concept. And this is independent of any particular language. In other words, this is kind of like a universal symbol that everyone can understand for the most part. So ideograms or ideographs, they can be things like the following images. Right? Now, when you see that image right there, what do you see? What do you think when you see that? And feel free to just blurt it out.
Stop, I think.
Yeah, stop. Now, what about this one?
No.
No, right. So those two are ideograms, right? This one especially, because the concept no, is a concept. It's not an object. It's not a thing. It's an idea. And we have all been trained to look at that symbol and understand that it means no. You could put a dog in the little circle. You could put a cat. You could put a hand. You could put a pipe. You could put a cigarette, and you'll always understand that that circle with the slash in it is telling you no, whatever. So the semantics of it, is going to change its meaning based on, whether or not you have that image behind it, right? This could be no for anything. This one, we all can pretty much understand that this is just saying stop, right? And we can only understand that it's a stop in the context of other traffic signs, right? But if a person were to not be a part of the culture that uses that, it could mean something completely different. Blocked. Yeah, it could be something blocked. Nikolai put the hammer and the sickle, right? If you understand that the hammer and sickle is a symbol for communism, basically, then you'll understand that culturally it's specifically, something that you'll find in like, say, Russia, communist Russia, or other communist countries. And now that it's here in the United States, because of the context in which, it was introduced, you'll understand that it's a bad thing. But for somebody in another country, it's a good thing. It's a sign of empowerment, right? So that's the semantics of that particular symbol. Let's see, I see a bunch of hands up. I don't know who raised their hand first, but let's go Abraham, then Jess, and then Karen.
Sorry, I left it from last time.
Oh, okay. Jess?
So I don't necessarily want an answer to this, but so I guess like in this day and age, or let's just say 20, 40, 100 years from now, like what would the rainbow be then? Like, would that be considered something that you could say that's semantics or not?
Yeah. If over time the rainbow, has changed in its meaning, and its usage, you might think of it as like, say, a gay pride symbol. But if it continues to be used as, the rainbow, with like the little clouds, and that kind of thing.
From like, not even like a Christian, like they go to church, but like it's like the light at the end of the tunnel type thing, like that Christian background, like it rained, but then the rainbow, the beauty of, the God's protection or his promise to the world.
Mm-hmm.
So when I see the rainbow, I guess it depends on where I'm seeing it.
Yeah.
Because I would automatically and then there's one other thing, that prohibited sign. I'm asking Ulysses right now. Babe, what was that episode from The Office where he had this prohibited sign or don't sign, and then he had the word on top? What was that? I know what that's called. What was the word? Because that's like on The Office too. Like I didn't really watch that. My friend does, but I watched one episode and it reminded me of that sign. But it was so funny because I didn't get it at first. But it was power of language because it said no, 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 or what was it? Oh, don't bother. Who was it? Don't bother who? Oh, don't bother my nephew or something like that. But it said don't, and then it had his nephew right, and then across to it.
Don't bother my nephew. Then it had the circle on it. So it's like those saying don't bother my nephew.
meaning he wanted him to bother the nephew. You hear him?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
so that's like a double negative, right? When you say the words don't, and then you have the circle with the slash through it, you're saying don't do that. Double negative meaning do it, right?
Right, but see, and when I read it, like I didn't see what he was laughing at, so I read it, and then I was like, oh, like, but it's interesting, like how even if you read things, because you just see the symbol, you don't even think about the words. You can get someone, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
that's all.
Yeah, I love The Office, by the way. Karen, and then Tina and David.
So I just have this random story that this totally reminds me of.
Mm-hmm.
So I was driving, actually my friend was driving in England, and he's like from there. So anyhow, so he's driving to England, and we're driving along, and then there's this big old sign, and the sign said, roadway liable to subsidence. And I looked at him and I was like, what does that mean? Right? And he said, oh, it means there could be potholes in the road. Or whatever. And it literally said roadway liable to subsidence. And I laughed so hard. I was like, okay, not only do I not even understand any of those words, like in the United States, it would be a picture. Like it wouldn't even be a picture, it'd be like a symbol. Like that's all it would be. So I don't know. I just thought it was.
And people would still say they didn't know what that means.
Yeah.
When reality is whatever it says in England, that's just the easiest way to do it. It says it all right there. Bada bing, bada boom.
Is it really though? You know, think about that though, right? Because what happens if a person can't read, right? What if you have a person that's low literate, you know, and doesn't understand that particular word?
A license. No
I went
offense.
to college. I went to college and I couldn't even understand the words.
Google. Well, that's why they should put a. Well, see, but that just depends on if you like words or not. Really, my son. I'm just saying, there's people that are younger than me that probably know what words are that I don't know. Not that they're any smarter than me. They just have to know more words. I don't know because they stuff. But it's like then they can put a little thing up there that says Google it. You know what I mean? There's so many ways now. That's like they could put that and then above it put Google it, and then everybody would just know.
True, but
it wouldn't since if they couldn't read.
Unless you're driving.
Yeah, I mean, if you're driving, see, and in that context, right?
Now I put another sign that says, "Don't act like you don't text." There's a bunch of signs.
Yeah, it'd be then just a bunch of signs, right? And it would have been so much easier to just have a pictogram or an ideogram as the word of the day is.
Language.
Tina and David. David.
I like what Abraham is saying because it's true. The most powerful are like the simple signs. Like if everybody knows what an eight or an octagon, a red octagon is. Everybody knows it means stop. Now everybody knows what the giant golden M means. Everybody, and it's not just things that you see. It's things that you hear. Like everybody pretty much the world knows what the word no means. So the most powerful signs are often very, very simplistic, but ones that stand out.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a reason why, certain colors are used when graphic designers are creating logos for particular brands, right? One color even might have a meaning that another color doesn't. Kathy?
I don't know how deep we can go here, but in the study of the Native Americans, like with the Mayans and the symbols, and then you compare that to the Andean cosmology, the elements are the same, but the structure of the elements, so there's different symbols that both had, but they meant the same exact thing. And so one of the things I see building up to here, and when we say symbiotic, semantics, and we get to the ideogram, is eventually they become sacred to the humanity that is living at that time. There is a sacredness. Like, I know this is going to sound crazy, but those McDonald's arches, in our culture, there is a little bit of a sacredness to those McDonald's arches. They symbolize our childhood. They symbolize a lot of things because we've grown up with those arches.
Yeah, exactly. And what Abraham says in the chat is also true, right? Those golden arches, they're Americana, right? They're a symbol of American, culture, of the culture of the United States, right? Not all American culture, but the United States culture, right? And capitalism.
And they're recognized throughout the world too.
Yeah. So symbols can have a lot of strength, a lot of power, right? And if you're part of that culture, or if you understand that culture thanks to its language, then you can, exchange ideas with the world. You can become part of that world too, right? And it can also be used as, either a tool for good or a tool for bad. So, all of these things, they start to sort of build up and become layer on layer.
I've been to places where there's not a McDonald's, and I do get kind of worried sometimes. I'm like, not because I want to go eat at McDonald's, but I'm just like, if I go to a neighborhood and I'm like, wait a minute, there's not enough like certain activities, I get worried. Like my ex-husband was from McAllister. When he would go visit me in Ohio, he was terrified. And I'm like, you walk around your neighborhood and you're scared to come. There's no tree, there's no light, like there's like no this, no that, nobody's driving down the street. Like, and he was scared. He had put chairs in front of the back door. He was like, what if someone comes in? Who's gonna hear me? Like, you know what I mean? It the perspective, I guess it goes back to the lesson before. It's like, whose perspective are you coming from? Like, what words are seducing and what words are other things?
Hurting. Yeah,
hurting, yeah. But yes, I love the golden arches. My kids, when we get off the freeway and they see the King Taco on the corner, it's so funny because he told me, he's like, that's when all their nerves go down. They're like, all right, we're home. Like as soon as they see the King Taco sign, they know it's probably about 10 more minutes and we're gonna be to the house,
Yeah.
And it's so cute that they the symbolism of that. To them, that's all, and I mean home, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm close to my mom's house.
Yeah. That's a lot of power to have there.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
They can just turn and go the other way.
Yeah. Abraham?
I just want to elaborate more into what David was saying. And yeah, the simplest are the most strong ways of communicating something. And that's why companies spend a lot of money and invest a lot of their resources and just the color or just the name, like McDonald's. Have you seen the movie? The guy says at the end, like, I like the name, that's why I chose you guys, because it sounds really American. Or the sound of necklace, and then you know exactly what are you getting into.
Yeah.
So the sharpest and the easiest to get, those are the most powerful signs. And I guess as poets, we need to find the right words, right, Luis?
Absolutely. The right words, the right symbol, and it also, is arbitrary, right? Because the symbol that you're going for can mean whatever you want it to mean based on the context in which you use it, right? And yeah, like we could go on and on about, the use of symbols and things like that, and the McDonald's arches. But let's actually get into some poetry that actually sort of is an example of how semiotics and semantics can change our understanding of something. So today's poem comes from Catherine Barnett. She was born 1960 and is an award-winning American poet and educator. Aquí también les traducí el poema y es sobre poesía. So, do I have a volunteer that would like to read the poem for us today? Feel free to just jump on in. I can't see you guys, so there is a hand that went up.
I'll read it in English.
All right, go for it.
The creative drive. A recent study found that poems increased the sale price of a home by close to $9,000. The years, however, have not been kind to poems. The Northeast has lost millions of poems reducing the canopy. Just a few days ago, high winds knocked a poem onto a power line a few blocks from my house. I had not expected to lose so many at once. We created a system that is not healthy for poems, said someone. Over the next 30 years, there won't be any poems where there are overhead wires. Some poems may stay as a nuisance, as a gorgeous marker of time.
Excellent. Thank you, Nikolai. Do I have a volunteer to read it in Spanish for us?
I'll try it.
Go for it.
Oh, who said one? If you know how to do it, then do it. Who was that?
That's me. It's Luz.
Okay, go for it.
Thank you. El impulso creativo, Catherine Barnett. Un estudio reciente encontró, thank you. Un estudio reciente encontró que los poemas aumentan el precio de venta de una casa por casi $9,000. Los años, a cambio, no han sido buenos con los poemas. El noreste ha perdido millones de poemas, reduciendo la fronda. Hace unos días, los vientos fuertes tumbaron a un poema encima de las líneas de electricidad, a unas cuadras de mi casa. No esperaba perder tantas de una vez. Hemos creado un sistema que no es saludable para los poemas, dijo alguien. Durante los próximos 30 años no habrá poemas en donde corren líneas de electricidad por encima. Unos poemas se quedarán como fastidio, como hermoso marcador del tiempo.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Luz.
Thank you.
Sorry about the typo there, guys. My bad.
It did throw me off.
Yeah. And I try so hard to capture it before. And I agree, it is a beautiful poem. So what are your thoughts? What does the poem mean for you? Thank you for the
branches, trees, paper. That's really what I think of it. Well, number one, the city came out when I first bought my house and put a tree and told me that it would bring value to my home because it has shade.
Yeah. So
a few years, so that much I knew that worked. But then I like what she says, because I have the palm tree, and sometimes, like, especially with these winds that were just here, like there was like a mess underneath, like, and I was so scared. I was like, oh my God, please don't let one of those things fall off and smack someone walking down my street. You know what I mean? Because I had neglected it, and I created a system that was not healthy for people to walk down my street. So, but yeah, that's what I really thought about. I was seeing the word palms instead of poems, but I knew it. I'm interpreting it as paper, trees, branches, and like the and you know, when you see a big tree, it is a huge marker, a gorgeous marker of time. Like the New York one, or just a big tree. It's pretty dope.
Yeah. What other thoughts do you guys have about the poem? Kathy?
I like the contrast. I don't know what kind of poem this is. I was kind of curious what kind of poem this is, because it starts like a little news study or a little study, and then it goes into some very deep symbolism about where we're putting our value and what's important to us. So I like that, you know, she puts like, this is what's happening to poems, but poems are not going anywhere. They're going to stay, even if they're going to be bothersome to some people. And the value of what we give it is completely different. It's not a monetary value. It's a ecosystem value more than anything.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is obviously in the context of the poem, right? It is giving the idea, the concept of poems, a certain kind of value, right? And the fact that it is a poem that is replacing the word trees, because I think most everyone can read the poem and think trees, right? Trees fall over onto power lines all the time. High winds can make a tree, sway back and forth, or do a lot of different things. But it's not trees. The word isn't trees. It's poems. And so,
well, they take it for granted.
Yeah, it's almost like calling out the fact that we take trees and poems for granted. But definitely, it is a poem that is trying to have fun with itself. And it is one simple word that's changed. Let's see, Ani wrote, it's talking about the loss of poetry or creative works' value in a materialistic society, but putting it into the words of materialism so we can understand and experience the sadness. And yes, it is semantics. So semantics is definitely playing a role in this. Because again, it's one single word that is changed, right? And that word is a word that we all understand to mean poems, right? Poetry. We as a society can all agree that this is about creativity, right? But imagine a person that doesn't understand the term poems, that doesn't understand English, and they read that and they're saying, well, this sounds like a tree, right? So the semiotics of it, right, the signifier of poems it's basically been altered, right? In a person's mind, it might make them think of trees, kind of like the way that it made Jess think about trees, and the way that she planted a tree in her yard, right? So, and I generally agree with Ani. I think that the fact that word was changed to be poems and poetry, it is helping us understand the value of poems in a different way. Any other thoughts about the poem itself? No? Seems like a pretty straightforward poem, I guess. In terms of the style of the poem, I forget the term itself, but when I was reading what the author wrote about this poem, they were actually explaining that when they were writing it with the intention of writing an ars poetica. So I've mentioned this term before. I'm gonna type it into our chat here, ars poetica. So the ars poetica is a type of poem that talks about your relationship to poetry, right? And so when Catherine Barnett was writing this particular poem that we just reviewed, they were writing it with this idea of writing a poem that expressed how they feel about poetry. And they were having fun with a like article, I guess, that they had read just before writing it, and made that connection of the value of trees to the value of poetry itself. So we'll kind of go back here to the poem itself to take a look at it. So here, again, a recent study found that poems increased the sale price of a home by close to $9,000. The years, however, have not been kind to poems. The Northeast has lost millions of poems, reducing the canopy. Just a few days ago, high winds knocked a poem onto a power line. A few blocks from my house. I had not expected to lose so many at once. We've created a system that is not healthy. For poems, said someone, over the next 30 years. There won't be any poems where there are overhead wires. Some poems may stay as a nuisance. as a gorgeous marker of time. So, as an ars poetica, it is positioning the idea, right, the signifier of poems as a thing that has value and a thing that is, losing its place in the world, right? There's been millions lost, and it's comparing it to a canopy. A canopy would be the overhang, the thing that is over and above the forest or the ecosystem. Right? And then it talks about poems have the ability to actually knock down power lines too, right? A poem, the high winds they're strong enough to knock down a poem. So a poem can even be a fragile thing, right? With a lot of weight and a lot of substance enough to knock down a power line. So if you really look at the poem itself as a whole, it is telling you that there is a lot of value, a lot of weight, a lot of, ecosystem value and the richness to poetry, to poems. Although some people consider them a nuisance or as something that is easily destroyed. Right? It is kind of your next assignment, but again, the idea of semiotics here is that the signifier, right, poems, is changing what we would normally expect to see in that kind of writing, right? The writing makes it sound like we're talking about trees. And the semantics, the way that the term poems is being used within the larger piece, it helps us understand the rest of the poem in a different way, right? That's how we're able to then interpret what I basically just walked away understanding from the poem, and that poems themselves have weight. They are part of an ecosystem. They are fragile enough to be knocked down by a high wind, but, have a special place in time. So, those two terms, those two concepts, they can really change the understanding overall of our, poem that we just read. Yeah, the context is changed by the semiotics, as Abraham put it. So, does anyone have any questions right now or anything that we haven't gone over yet? And welcome, Raymond, by the way. It seems like you guys don't have any questions. Nothing at all.
Because we're scared now.
You're scared. Well, there's no reason to be afraid. So, I think
this poem is really genius, man. Really interesting way of changing the entire context of things.
Mm-hmm.
It really is brilliant. It sounds very simple. Mm-hmm. I want to say that it seems more simple than the actual writing of it. The kind of thought that you need to put into to put yourself in the mindset to create something like this, I think is probably not that simple, as we're about to find out, apparently. God help us.
No, I think it is. I think to me, it feels like from the first, who was the first quote we read from the very first class it was? That one guy.
Are you referring to the manifesto week or this week?
No, the very first one, manifesto week. What was the first quote we read there? I don't have it in front of me. I don't know if you have it, but to me, it kind of speaks to that because he says something like that. It's very simple. That's from what I remember. Mm-hmm. Like almost like it's very simple to explain. Like if you use the right words mm-hmm. to get someone to be aware, because mm-hmm. just like they said, it's so brilliant because but she didn't use any complex words. She just described trees on a street. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It got all of these levels of different thinking, right? Mm-hmm. Like what do the power lines represent? The wind, how strong can wind really be? I guess how the wind, if it's words, if it's stronger, right? Mm-hmm. And wounds, seduce, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's maybe we're going to make it harder on us than it is.
Yeah, I think that, there's definitely no reason to be afraid, because this is actually a very, very simple thing to understand. Really what it comes down to is, this is all metaphor, right? Metaphor is, in fact, the meaning that you want to place on anything, right? A cup can be a cup, but a cup can be something so much greater depending on the context in which you're using it. A poem can be just a simple thing that's written on paper, but in the context of this poem that we just read, poems are things that are powerful. Poems are things that are, long lasting and part of an ecosystem. And for some people, a nuisance, right? For some people, a bother, right? Or something that can just be thrown away and lost. But, yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
I keep getting the feeling of an inception, like we're incepting something in our phone.
Yeah. Ultimately, and remember, our theme overall is unity, right? And really think about the quotes that we talked about at the beginning. Language can both seduce and it can wound, right? The word that you use can either make someone feel good or make someone feel bad in the context that you use it in, right? Really think about what happened the last 4 years and the way in which certain words were used against us, right? There's definitely a lot of strength in language. And if you understand the culture in which the language is used, that's an added layer, right? I don't think that most people understood what QAnon was before. I'm sure this month, after the riots in DC, now QAnon is on almost everyone's radar. But the term itself, QAnon, right? If you know it just by hearing it, you may not necessarily understand what it means, but for the people that are part of that culture, for the people that follow QAnon, and just the letter Q, just the letter Q by itself has a very deep, significant meaning for that subculture, right? So we're talking about, something that is both semiotics and semantics all in one, right? And it's something, that simple little letter is something that divided our country, right? You want me to spell the word QAnon? There you go. It's in the chat.
That's the first time I ever heard that word.
You probably don't follow the news too much then, which is probably okay, But I mean, for the purpose of this lesson, like if you know what I'm talking about, then right? You know what you know. And so, these things can be divisive, right? That, like I said, that simple little letter, the Q by itself, now, can be a very divisive thing. You see somebody wearing it and you know what it means. If you're part of that culture, that subculture, you're going to be like, oh, that's one of my people's, right? Just like if I'm
Anon, is that for anonymous? Because I go to Al-Anon.
I suppose it is for anonymous. I mean, I don't really know the exact term, its definition, but it's this like conspiracy theory that is being perpetrated by the internet and by.
What are the semiotics of the Q, Luis? I'm asking you from the homework.
Yeah. The semiotics of the Q itself now is, that it's a person that follows that particular ideology, which is a white supremacist ideology, ultimately.
Q?
Yeah.
No.
So right there, right, that's the semiotics of it, right? That symbol of the Q, it's become an ideogram. It's become, the symbol of that idea or concept of white supremacy and, whatever, people want to assign to it beyond that. Kathy?
I was just going to, the last time I brought up the Declaration of Independence as a manifesto, but now I'm going to bring in the U.S. Constitution since we are talking about QAnon. They are also protecting the Constitution, and I've been curious and quite inquisitive as, are we protecting the same Constitution? Are we looking at the Constitution in the same way. What words are they getting from the Constitution that supports the action? Because for me, it means something completely different, even though I wasn't originally part of the history. That's a sacred document for me as well. So it's always a conversation I would love to have with someone, one of the capitalists. I watch them so deeply to try and understand what words in the Constitution did they feel empowered them? Where did that come from? So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. And, there's, I don't have an answer to that, but, it could be even like, say, a person's, desire to follow one person's interpretation of it, one individual, because it meets their own ideology. Right? That's the way that religions work. That's the way that political ideals work. That's even the way that individuals' cultures can work, right? So it's again, it goes back to what we've been saying, I think, from the beginning, is that there is a strength or a power in language that, can either hurt or bring people in, intrigue people. So, Abraham, I saw that you had your hand raised, and then I think David and Tina were also raising their hand.
Just a little on reflection of, what's her name? Catherine?
Catherine.
Spoke. The Constitution's being rethinking, like every generation. We have to make sense of it. So that's what everybody does. And we have political parties, and they will try to find their own meaning. And at the end, who wins? I guess the votes. Best case scenario.
Yeah. Or he who tells the stories rules society, right? Which is the other quote that we talked about. Yeah. We are deciding what it means, always, as a community, for sure. Yeah. David, Tina?
So, just to go back to QAnon for a moment, it all goes back to Orwell's quote about language limiting, which my synonym for limiting in his case, in the way that he's using it, is oppressing. And obviously, QAnon is of the oppressors, and even McDonald's is considered by many people to be a symbol of oppression. Many places, many people, as much as we have warm feelings about it, a lot of people don't. And that all kind of goes back to the poem too. So she's playing with that conceit that many signs have multiple meanings, and she's giving a multiple meaning to the word poem. And like Annie says, that's part of it, the genius of it.
Yeah, it's such a simple thing, right? She just took one word out of a scientific concept and changed it into something that is creative, right? And now we have a poem that speaks to the power of poetry and the beauty of it. And ultimately, that's what your assignment is going to be this week. So your writing prompt is to really, find a text, find something that inspires you, that is grounded in science, and switch out that one particular concept for poetry or for language, right? Think about what Catherine Barnett did, and use that as inspiration for speaking about poetry and poems and the kind of power that they have to potentially even unite us, right? Because ultimately that is where our theme for this series is now, right? Talking about uniting. And we want to bring people in under the banner of poetry. And it is unfortunate that Lawrence Ferlinghetti passed away, So I hope that the rest of you are also feeling like Miss Luce and are prepared to write your manifesto. Because who knows, maybe this might be your manifesto, So, does anyone have any questions about what your writing prompt is? Again, to sort of simplify it, it's to take a scientific concept and replace it with poetry. as its, way of explaining the world. Can I write that in the chat? All right. So again, take a scientific concept and replace its core with poetry or language to show the power of poetry and language. Sorry, sometimes as I'm explaining them, they might not always make sense. So that's why I like to make sure that I repeat it a few times. And obviously in repeating it, it becomes more streamlined. So, but it is now in the chat for those of you that requested it. And again, use Catherine Barnett's poem as kind of like inspiration to show you that it doesn't have to be that difficult to write.
And it doesn't have to be the word poetry. It's some other kind of concept.
Yeah, it could be poetry, language, poems, words, anything that's literary in scope. All right. So, any final questions or thoughts? No? All right. Well, in that case, we'll call it a night. Have a great week, everyone. One more time, as a reminder, next week we will be workshopping poems. So next week, be prepared if you want to share with the rest of the group. Be prepared to share your work, and we'll give you feedback. So no lesson, just straight workshop. All right. So have a good night, everybody. Oh.
Not for everybody. Don't freak out.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
I'm a mess.